We've seen that oftentimes the biggest clients in a firm are the least profitable. And the cycle that we see a lot of firms fall into is they reach this point where they're growing and their profit isn't improving. In some cases, it's getting worse. And that's an indigestion problem.
Welcome to the Happy Clients Podcast, brought to you by Dot & Company. Whether you're a virtual assistant, an agency owner, or a client-facing account manager, we all deal with clients. Lucky for you, client management is what we do best. Now, let's dig in, chat cam life, and have some fun along the way. Cheers to Happy Clients.
E2M is a proud sponsor of the Happy Clients Podcast. If you're running a digital agency, you know the hardest part isn't getting clients. It's delivering consistently without burning out your team or hurting margins. E2M helps agencies scale confidently as a behind-the-scenes, white-label fulfillment partner. From web development and SEO to paid media, US-based content, e-commerce, and even AI, they plug into your agency so your clients get great results under your brand. No freelancers, no chaos, just reliable delivery that helps you keep clients happy and growing. Find out how E2M can support your agency at e2msolutions.com/dot. Well, Marcel, welcome back to the Happy Clients Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Taylor. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in a little bit deeper into the profitability conversation. So just to preface, as an account manager, I think my responsibility is beyond just keeping clients happy, not just beyond even really just keeping clients around. I want to own the whole success of the agency at the end of the day. You know, I need to make sure that I am playing a role when it comes to the profitability and the success of the agency at the end of the day. But since this is your whole business is based around profitability, I would love to get your thoughts on where account managers have the most influence on profitability in their role and where they might be underestimating that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question. And I think I've believed this for a little while, and it's just accelerating that like account management is one of the highest value roles in a firm, period, full stop. If you think about like a lot of the doing is getting compressed by AI and the tools, and it's getting commoditized. Like what remains is essentially strategy and client relationship. And the actual human parts of managing a project are going to become like the vast majority of the cost and time center in a project is like the conversation that allows us to understand what we're trying to accomplish so that we can then ideally use AI to get it done really, really quickly, but precisely, and then we get the right thing done. So I'll preface this whole conversation by saying that. And then I'll also acknowledge that, you know, account management is a really tricky term and it's a really tricky role because if you ask 10 different AMs what they do every day and what the scope of their role is, you'll probably get 10 slightly different answers. And one of the reasons for that is you have this interesting intersection of account and project manager where some account managers are playing double duty. They're literally doing both jobs. In other cases, they have a project management counterpart and then they have to sort of interact with that, and that there can be tension that's built into that relationship. And the other thing that's true about this sort of intersection of project and account management is it sits in the middle of every other function in the business. It sits next to new business. It sits next to finance and profitability, as you mentioned, and project management. It sits next to operations. It sits next to delivery. And the reason I think that it takes a different shape in different organizations is because they are responsible for sort of collecting inputs from all of the stakeholders in those different departments, including the clients, and sort of facilitating the coordination of all of those different components so that they work well together. And so if there's a weak input, they've got to go compensate for it. So they sort of take on this amorphous shape based on what the structure of their organization is and what the weak points in that organization are. So with all of that said, the question was, how are account managers accountable to profitability? And at the end of the day, there's a couple of key components to this. The first is, of course, retention. And I don't think we have to spend a lot of time talking about why retention has a massive impact on profitability. It's way less expensive to keep a client. It's way less expensive to sell to an existing client and expand the amount of value that they get from the firm and therefore the amount of money that they spend with the firm than it is to go acquire new clients. I think that's a fairly well understood concept. So that's the obvious one. The less obvious one is around scope. And I think account managers, whether they're playing double duty on project management or not, they tend to be on the front lines of scope management. And one of the biggest misses, I think, for a lot of account managers is not understanding how the nature of the contract with the client changes the account management posture. And to give you an example of this, it's like your posture in a time and materials contract and your incentive structure is radically different than in a deliverable-based or a value-based contract, where in a deliverable-based or a value-based contract, your job becomes much more about scope protection, right? If the client's asking you for things, you're like, yes, but, I have to protect the scope, and you want to get their needs served, but then it's like, it starts to become a negotiation. Well, what if we do a scope change? What if we open up another SOW for this? Like, what if we start working on another project for next quarter to incorporate these things that you want to do? You do some horse trading. So it's a different dynamic than if you're selling time and materials or an abstracted form of time and materials. Your incentive is actually to like try to get the client doing as much as possible. It's like finding every opportunity that you can to provide value for them. And the dynamic there is very, very different. It's not to say that you shouldn't always be looking for opportunities in a fixed contract, but like the way that conversation happens and the dynamics of those conversations are very different. And I think that if an account manager is not aware of those things, they could inadvertently shoot themselves in the foot, or perhaps show up to a conversation and not really run that conversation in a way that benefits them or the client, because they just weren't really tuned into like, how does the structure of this relationship contractually change the dynamic of how we have discussions about scope and doing more or doing less and so on.
So do you see in most cases, the account manager, are they actually looking at the profitability within each client account, or do most agency owners keep that behind the curtain?
It really depends on the firm, and it depends on the structure of the firm, of course, as well. Like I think a lot of times that's seen as more of an operations and project management responsibility. But again, in a firm where account management is also playing that role or is very, very tightly coupled, like they have a strong dynamic, I think it makes sense to have them at least have visibility into that and ideally be accountable to it as well. Now, of course, there's another challenge there, which is that like project profitability is not necessarily trivial to measure, especially to measure accurately. So there's not a lot of firms that are doing it. And I think that of the firms that are doing it, there's a very, very small subsection that are doing it well or accurately or in a way that is like, we'll call it delivering like a lot of value from a decision-making and insight perspective. But yes, ultimately, like I think account managers should be at least informed, but ideally accountable to project profitability because they have a significant influence on it. They probably, in a lot of cases, have a lot of influence on the pricing and scoping process as the client is coming in. Again, that's going to vary from firm to firm, but a lot of times you're going to play a role in bringing the client into the organization and working through the scoping and pricing and proposal process. And then, of course, throughout the client relationship, you're often going to be the first line of defense for when things change. The client wants something different. They're not happy with something. Their goals have changed. Something's happening in the market that's affecting their business, and maybe you need to come to them with some ideas on how to respond to that proactively. In an ideal situation, that's what you're doing. And in all of those situations, you are influencing the scope of the engagement, and you're likely also influencing how much work that client is doing with you.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm an account manager and let's say I know enough to know that the project is going well from a profitability perspective, what are some of those flags that might come up through the engagement with a client that I might say, okay, this could lead down a road that could cause an unprofitable outcome here? What are some of those flags that you're seeing that I'm just putting myself in the seat as an account manager that I might see on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, well, I mean, the obvious one, and this is one that'll probably resonate with a lot of account managers, is like the client wants more things for free.
Yeah.
And we're spending a lot more time than we expected to on this client, and we're not actually getting an incremental income from it. And so practically speaking, what that often looks like is utilization is really high on the team. Effective rate is really low. Effective rate being, if you look at how much money you got paid and you look at how many hours you worked, and we ignore like, is it billable? Is it unbillable time? It's just like, how much time do we put into this project? How much money do we make from it? And the effective rate is declining. That's a really good sign that the relationship is kind of going south. And I think this is one of the tricky dynamics of the account manager is they are in an interesting position where they are trying to negotiate a relationship between two sides that often have conflicting incentives. They want to advocate for the client and keep them happy, because of course the client needs to be happy if they're going to continue to work with the agency, but they also need to protect the interest of the agency and make sure that the relationship remains sustainable, because if it's not, then like the agency is not going to be able to work with that client for very long either. And so there's a needle to thread there. And certainly having visibility into the health of a project allows you to make those kinds of decisions in context, because I'm not here to say as the profitability guy that there's never a time to make a concession for a client. Sometimes it does make sense to throw them a bone, to draw outside the lines. Sometimes things get messed up and it's on you and you have to take accountability for that and make it right. Other times, maybe you just like didn't do a good enough job of understanding their needs and you find that out later and you've got to make it right. And sometimes there's just an opportunity that you know is going to be able to lead to more work. And it does make sense to make that bet and make that investment. But you can make those decisions in context when you understand, like, is this project healthy? Is it trending in the right direction? And is the client learning to treat us in a way that ultimately does not benefit either of us long term? Mm-hmm. Are he like treating us in a way where we're going to become resentful and not going to want to work with them anymore? Yeah. So it's a very, very thin line to dance, as you know, having been in this space for a long time. Absolutely.
And I think, like you explained, sometimes you're going to have clients that just naturally suck up more time and they're the bad guy. You know, they're the ones that just take the energy from the team. But at the end of the day, the agency owner is saying, well, we need to keep them around in order for this business to continue. Like, we need to keep this client on the roster. But it's tricky, right? As the account manager, you are dancing on both lines of like keeping the client happy, but you may not like working with every client. But then on the flip side, you need to keep the clients to stay profitable. So
yeah, but there's a trap. So we'll zoom out. We'll talk about a couple of like fundamental concepts that I think is important for account managers to understand. And these are just fundamental concepts to the profitability of the agency. And the first is like the conflation of revenue and profit, right? And in particular, the size of an engagement and the profitability of an engagement. We've seen that oftentimes the biggest clients in a firm are the least profitable. And the cycle that we see a lot of firms fall into is they reach this point where they're growing and their profit isn't improving. In some cases, it's getting worse. And that's an indigestion problem. And you know that this is a challenge when the team is constantly stressed out and, you know, working lots of hours, like utilization is very high, cash flow is tight. And yet, every time a new client comes in, there's always this rush of like, well, we need to go hire more people to make up room for this extra client. If that's the situation that you're in, it's very likely that the best thing to do in that moment is to pause, go do an assessment of how profitable your clients are. And the next client that comes in that is going to force you to make a hire, don't go make that hire yet. Use that leverage to go renegotiate the terms with your worst client. And there's two outcomes and both of them are good in that situation. The first outcome is that they say, okay, like we agree to the new terms and the profitability of that client improves. And then you move up to the next one and you repeat that process until outcome number 2 happens, which is the client says, yeah, I don't agree to those terms. And you go, no problem. Like, we're obviously not the right partner for you anymore. Your needs have changed. We're happy to introduce you to someone else that we think is a better fit. And you replace that unprofitable client with the new client that's much more profitable. And you systematically remove the indigestion from the business. Very important that you only do this when the team is maxed out and you're getting to the point where it's like, we're going to have to hire some more people. That is like one thing to keep in mind, right? As an account manager is you tend to be super focused on retention of all of your clients, but that can put you in a mindset where you're overlooking, like, is this client actually worth hanging on to? And that mindset can also prevent you from recognizing this moment in time where it's like, we are in a position where we have leverage and actually using that leverage to improve the context of the business overall. It's a missed opportunity for a lot of firms where they just start hiring and hiring and hiring as they get maxed out, and they never have the foresight to stop and say, like, wait a second, this is an opportunity for us to kind of clean things up here and right size some client relationships that are ultimately going to create drag for us the entire existence of the business until it gets addressed. So that's part one. And then the part two is going to be about pricing models, but I'll pause there for a moment.
Yeah, I'm curious. When you're working with agency owners and this is your recommendation, you need to go back to your least profitable clients and, work your way up. How many push back on that?
Oh, lots of them do. And usually the reason that they push back on it is they're thinking about it in the wrong context, right? So it's like, if they're not busy, obviously don't do that.
Right.
Like if your utilization isn't maxed out, that's clearly a bad idea. Right.
Yeah.
And so like what I'm describing here is a moment in time where it's like your two options are increase your revenue, but increase your cost in almost a directly proportional way, and continue to have the rest of this business be slogging away with unprofitable clients, or take this client and go try to use that leverage to improve the profitability of a bunch of those clients or replace one with a better one. That is just objectively, mathematically a better outcome. Like it's not, you could get subjective about this and there's some emotions tied up in it, but like if you just look at the math, it's like that makes sense to do in that moment. I think the thing that gets people over the fence is when you actually run the numbers and you're like, hey, here's a client that you're working for $18 an hour on. That's just the facts. It's like, how do you feel about that? Yeah, not great. And like, how many sleepless nights have you had worrying about this client? Chances are the number is a lot. And so it's like, how relieved would you be if you no longer had to work with them? Now, the challenge here is that a lot of times those clients are the bigger clients. And so it takes like more than one to replace them. So that can be a very legitimate challenge and some pushback. In those cases, you might have to also look at overhead. That becomes a factor. You might have to think about like temporarily resizing the team and looking at that as like a restructure opportunity. But in a perfect world, you're at a place where you can basically swap a client and it's almost a sideways move. And in doing that, like the profitability of the business improves. But certainly initially the reaction from a lot of folks is a negative one. And most of that has to do with just the emotional side of this, like not being comfortable with having that conversation. But there is a way to have it that is not adversarial. And the way I like to approach that conversation for all the account managers that are listening is like, hey, client, it's been amazing working with you and supporting you. A lot has changed. Your business has grown. Your needs have evolved. The way that we started this relationship is no longer really enough to support you and like accomplish all the things that you want to accomplish. And we're concerned that with the scope of our current engagement, like we're just not going to be able to do all the things that we know that you need to do. And so here's what, we're proposing as a way to get on the right engagement level, essentially, to like accomplish your goals. And if that's not something that's possible, no hard feelings. We totally understand. We're happy to try to connect you to someone else that we think might be a better fit to support you at this stage in your growth. That's like a very service-oriented way to have this conversation. It doesn't need to be like, hey, you're not paying us enough money. Please give us more money. Yeah. That's obviously not the right way to have that conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And I think, I get this pushback all the time from agency owners, even when talking about bringing in an account manager. They're like, but my biggest client, they're not going to want to work with them. And, they always have all these emotional reactions to change. And so I figure when we're talking about trying to increase, the massive clients they've worked with for 10 years, they're going to say, well, I'm too scared. And from the outside looking in, it is probably the most important thing that you could do when it comes to evolving your business and being able to grow. And so, I was curious what you get pushback on. So that's interesting.
It's an important note because like, I think people think about growth and it's like, well, if we do that, then we'll bring in these new clients and we won't really grow. And, that's true. For a period of time, your growth rate will probably slow down. But your profit and your cash flow is going to increase significantly. And a lot of firms, in my experience, are not growing because they're constantly cash constrained. And growth is expensive. Growth requires cash. It requires investments in overhead. Essentially, like the faster you grow, the more you have to build the business out ahead of where it is today. Right. And so that begets cash flow. And so like if you are not growing as fast as you'd like, I would encourage you to consider is this a function of like, well, we're just kind of always starved for oxygen in the business? And like, would it serve you to take 3 or 6 months to dramatically improve the cash flow in the business? And then would you be in a better position to grow faster after that and with far less operational drag? And for a lot of firms, the answer is yes. That would actually, if you crop out and you think about this on a longer time horizon, it's absolutely the right move.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It's just that fear gets in the way, you know, it's like all these things make sense, but then you're like, but what if we don't grow? And what if we, you know, it makes an agency owner spiral. And, you know, listening to what you're saying, I'm like, yeah, that totally makes sense. And then I hear them on in my other ear. I'm like, oh, the fear comes in, but you know, that's growing a business.
There's something else that I think is worth acknowledging here, which is there's probably some account managers listening to this saying, you know, that all makes sense and it sounds really good, but like the way that my compensation structure is architected, or the way that the metrics that I'm held accountable to are architected, I have no incentive to do any of this. And so I think that that's worth acknowledging for a moment. Is like, I think the common approach to compensating an account manager in a firm is like the performance aspect of that is going to be tied to some kind of a retention metric. It might be net revenue retention, where you're factoring in both revenue churn and revenue expansion. It might be tied more to expansion, but like generally speaking, it's a bit myopic in that it doesn't actually really pay attention to profitability. And so in that context, an account manager is not only going to not be incentivized to be thinking this way, they're probably going to work against that because of the incentive structure. That's not their fault. That's human nature. I think like the old saying is, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. So if you're an account manager that's like, hey, I would really love to be doing some of this stuff, but right now, like, I think it's challenging because it would actually like hurt my numbers. It would hurt my performance in terms of how I'm evaluated. That's probably a worthwhile conversation to surface with your agency owner, because chances are they're going to be like, well, yeah, at the end of the day, I want more profit. And so it's like, okay, well, maybe we should talk about how to get more aligned to that so that, you know, I'm in a position where I'm rewarded for helping you make more profit, as opposed to the current structure in which like most likely an account manager is going to get punished for that just in terms of what their scorecard looks like.
Absolutely. And, you know, as a business owner, I would love for someone to come to me and be thinking the way I'm thinking. Right? That's so rare. So if you could take this conversation and get in the head of your agency owner and say, I want to help you make more money, well, they're going to love you for that.
Yeah. And this is where I think like, I really like the power of focusing the entire team on what we call delivery margin, what other people might call gross margin. I think it's like a really good compound metric. And if you can get everybody to understand it and understand how to move that metric, it creates a lot of alignment regardless of what the structure of your team looks like in terms of like delivery and ops and account management and project management and new business. Like if everyone's sort of incentivized around delivery margin, chances are they're going to start over a long enough time period, like making decisions that actually affect the bottom line and is more balanced in terms of their thinking.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I'd love to hear your thoughts on pricing strategies. I know you touched on it. Yeah. Because that plays into this in a massive way.
Yes. And I'll speak to this from the context of an account manager. And it's one of the most overlooked aspects of pricing. We could talk about pricing in terms of like profitability. And of course, one of the ideas there is I think a lot of people are focused on which pricing model will get you the biggest revenue number. And the actual purpose of a pricing model is to maximize profitability. And people conflate those things as being the same, and they are often correlated, but they are not inherently the same. Because it's like, it doesn't matter if I double the price of a project if I've tripled the scope of that project. I'm probably not winning in that scenario, especially not on a relative basis. But the other side of pricing that people don't really consider is this actually accretive to the client relationship? And so what I mean by that is like the way that we're structuring this pricing model, does it get in the way of how we need to work with this client to actually be successful with them? Or does it support working with the client in a way that helps them be successful? And I think the most common example of this is firms that do really complex work, or work that has a lot of inherent uncertainty, or that requires a very iterative process, trying to force themselves into a flat rate or a productized or a value-based pricing model because that's like the cool thing to do. And it just actually ends up getting in the way of the client relationship. And so to give you an example of this, let's say you're building like a super complex web app for a client. like a super complex digital experience. And it's in like this kind of novel space, and there's not really a lot of examples of this having been done before. And there's still a lot of unanswered questions on the client side about like, who's the customer and how should this work? And like, like, how are we going to design this application? Well, anybody that's designed complex software or gone through like complex UX situations will know that it's like, well, the right way to approach this is basically agile or some kind of iterative process where we're going to do a little bit of work. We're going to figure out that we were wrong about a bunch of assumptions that we had made. We're going to adjust, and then we're going to do a little bit more work, and we're going to figure out what other assumptions we were wrong about. We're going to keep sort of changing what we're doing based on what we're learning, so that by the time we get to the end of the project, we'll have actually built the right thing, as opposed to the old way of building software, which is waterfall, which is like, let's make all the assumptions up front, spend the entire budget and timeline, and then find out everything we were wrong about at the end. And then no one's happy, right? Or likely that's going to be the outcome. So of course, everyone would agree like, oh yeah, the first approach sounds like it's more likely to have us be successful. And even if we were naive and we thought, oh, well, no, we're going to use the waterfall method, I think everybody knows that there's a very high likelihood that at some point throughout that project, the client's going to be like, hey, like things have changed. We thought the customer was this. Turns out the customer is that. We thought that the app needed to do this. Turns out the app needs to do that. We thought that it was going to be this way. It's actually going to be that way. And if we have structured this as a contract in which the scope is fixed, every time something changes, every time we learn something, every time we need to make an adjustment, the contract is in the way. Because the scope was fixed. The scope is X, Y, Z in this amount of time for this amount of money. And so it's literally a roadblock every single time you have to do the fundamental thing that you've been hired to do, which is like learn and adapt and iterate towards a solution for the client in this particular context. That's like the way of working that makes sense in this scenario. So it would make much more sense to structure a contract in that context where that's not the case, where ideally, in that scenario, there's actually a lot of value in time having been sold. And it doesn't have to be hours. It could be a cross-functional team being sold in bi-weekly blocks. It could be sprint-based pricing, could be credit-based pricing. There's lots of ways to structure a time materials contract that is not just like selling hours. But in that scenario, it's like something changes, no problem. The profitability of the engagement is not affected at all. It's just, okay, well, what's a higher priority? What are we swapping out? What are we doing for a second, third? And you just keep working together. And so that's an example of like, if you've priced that for profitability, the next consideration is like, what makes more sense for the way we need to work with this client to be successful? And I don't think enough people are thinking about that aspect of pricing. They're just looking at like, what does it do for us? Or how does it make us feel? Or, does it cure this sort of insecurity that has been installed in us by people selling value-based pricing courses on LinkedIn? Or is it actually beneficial to the client relationship? And I think this is a really important one for account managers, because maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking like, oh, I've actually experienced this before, where I just feel like, why did we structure a contract like this for a project that is constantly changing? Like, it's just such a pain in the butt. And so it's like, well, it's actually avoidable. And the key differentiation there is like, if you know the scope is not going to change a whole lot, then probably it makes sense to go towards a fixed or value-based contract. And if you know there's going to be a lot of fluidity, leaning towards time and materials or some abstractive version of that actually still makes a lot of sense. I think that's a place where there's a real case for that pricing model still.
That's interesting. And I think as an agency owner, developing pricing structures is hard. You feel like once you come up with something, that has to stick and that has to stay, but it's not the reality. And when I was growing my business, for example, I knew I wanted to sell it someday. So creating a productized, simple offer was like all I was focused on. But now thinking back, like maybe that wasn't the right thing to do, and maybe I should have evolved it.
Well, the thing that's interesting, if I recall correctly, like you sold an abstracted time materials model, right? Like you didn't try to sit down and write down all the tasks that an account manager was going to do every month. And then every time that a client asked their account manager to do something that wasn't on that list, you had this, stop the assembly line and get on the phone with the client and be like, hey, that's not in the scope. Let's add it to the scope, or let's remove something from the scope. And it's like, no, of course, there's no way that would have worked for you. And so what you did was you said, like, you get this portion of an account manager, and then the question is just like, what's important? And if things changed, it was like, great, is that more or less important than the other things that we are already doing? And it was just fluid. Like the way that you structured your engagements allowed your account managers to do what was necessary for that relationship to work well, which was just adapt. And as long as it stayed within the container of like, this is roughly the scope of the person that you have purchased, and you obviously knew your margins and that was all good, then it worked out well. But imagine how much of a pain it would have been to have a fixed scope. Like there's no way that would have worked. You would have spent all day on the phone renegotiating scopes with clients because account management is like so fluid. It's just fundamentally incompatible.
It is. It is, absolutely. So let's kind of leave our account manager listeners with this. If I'm an account manager working in an agency and I want to do an amazing job, of course, and I want to grow, and I want the agency owner to see that I'm thinking like them, in this profitability. I have my profitability hat on.
Yeah.
What advice would you give an account manager?
I would encourage you to, number one, listen to the Agency Profit podcast.
Yeah.
And, consume all of our free resources. Like you'd be amazed. The toolkit is basically a free course. And if you take that, and you actually like watch all the videos, and I know it's hard. I know it's very difficult. It's me talking at you for a couple of hours about math. But if you can get through that, I promise you will have a massive lift in your career because you'll be smarter than, and I'm saying this from having spent 7 years talking to a half a dozen agency owners every week for 7 straight years. I could tell you that if all you did was sit through the course that's free in the Agency Profit Toolkit, you would know more about agency profitability than 90% of people that own and run agencies today. So that's the first thing that I would encourage you to do. And then once you do that, go sit down with your leadership team and just start asking questions. Hey, how do we think about profitability here? And when we sell a project, how do we know that we're setting ourselves up for success? And get into the weeds, like what's the math? How do we figure out what it's going to cost us to do this? How do we know that there's enough margin or not? How do we know that this scope is high or low risk? How do we think about the success of a project when we measure it? Are those things consistent with one another? Right? Like, how are you measuring success? And how are you planning for success? And I think in asking those questions, you will already be adding a lot of value because there's not a lot of people actually pressing for those answers in a thoughtful way within the organization. And in doing that, I think that you will stimulate conversations that will help you step into a more involved role, add more value, be more accountable to this if that's what you want to do. And hopefully it'll be a great learning experience for you along the way. And so like, I think from that perspective, you can't really lose because even if none of that stuff materializes, hopefully you'll come out of it with more knowledge that you are empowered with in your career. So that would be my advice. It's a little self-serving, but I do honestly believe like if you go watch what's in the toolkit, you will come out of it far, far, far better off.
Absolutely. And that's such great advice because as we'll call it recovering business owner, I didn't have anybody who came to me asking those questions. And I would have immediately, if somebody came to me with that wealth of knowledge or even just the curiosity, I would have just put them on a pedestal and would have said, wow, these people that person's going somewhere. So That's great advice. Thank you so much, Marcel. Where can people learn about the course, learn about you, Parakeeto?
You can head to parakeeto.com/toolkit if you want to get access to that mini course that I just talked about. It sort of walks you through the 101 fundamentals of how to think about profitability in an agency and provide some free tools as well that you can use to do some math and impress your leadership team. If you want to listen to a podcast that's mostly about profitability and features amazing guests like Taylor, you can check out the Agency Profit Podcast anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And if you want to reach out to me, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always there nerding out and DMing with people. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Marcel. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to another episode of the Happy Clients Podcast. We'll see you on the next one.
Cheers to happy clients.